Peace and blessings, everyone. This is Rasharn Medina with a look inside. Today, I wanted to talk about being rigid. This is very similar to the stubbornness video I just released, and I'm considering it a follow-up. But I wanted to talk about it being rigid because it takes on a slightly different form than being stubborn. So, when it comes to stubbornness, we talked about how it's kind of like you're choosing to stick to a course of action or stick to a way of being in terms of how you carry yourself and the things you do. Whereas, from my perspective, rigidity is more a way that we hold ourselves. It's more of like a posture, it's a frame, it's a way that we compose ourselves, especially internally. Whereas stubbornness, to me, it kind of comes across as a more external thing that we kind of act out. So with being rigid, there can be, in a limited way, there can be some benefits. Rigidity can ensure that at least we don't buckle under certain types of immediate stressors or tough situations that come up. But in the long haul, and in very extreme cases, being rigid can actually backfire on us, because there's a balance that we can find when it comes to flowing with something, being flexible, and being solid. When we get, basically, if we get to be rigid, that kind of indicates, at least to me, that we've gone too much on being solid. We've become overly solid, and there's no flexibility, there's no giving or budging in any type of healthy way. So it's almost like if you thought about the physical body and it was basically just made of stone, instead of having, blood and mucus and all these, and cartilage and all these different other things, water in the body. If the body was just made out of stone and it's rock solid, you wouldn't be able to do anything. You would be stuck. You'd be paralyzed. You would not be able to adjust yourself. You would just be a statue, literally. Whereas the way our bodies actually operate, we have bone, so there is some density there. We have muscle, we have organs, all these other things, but we also have fluids in our body that basically enable us to we have joints as well, and tendons and all these other things, cartilage, and these help us to be flexible and to be able to move and operate different and in a more dynamic way than if we were rigid and we were stuck and we were just like basically solid all the time, overly solid. So I use that analogy to talk about life, how we can get to be very rigid as well. And when we're overly rigid, that kind of can manifest us as actually being very brittle and fragile, because sometimes when we're extremely basically rigid or solid, it's kind of constricting on yourself, and that lack of flexibility can lead to something breaking very easily. If something is overly solid, it's actually easier to break it once you hit a certain point of stress, a certain amount of stress on that thing. Whereas if there's a certain amount of flexibility, it may take some damage, it may appear to slightly give or budge, but it won't buckle, it won't fall. Whereas something that is rigid may appear to be impenetrable, invincible up until a certain point, but if you basically strike it hard enough, it will shatter completely. And I look at that the same way, just as when it comes to being rigid as a whole. If we hold a rigid posture, and I'm saying this just from personal experience as a whole, if we're rigid about things, or we're rigid within ourselves, we'll appear to have a certain way of being. We may appear, everything's all fine on the surface. Nothing could ever go wrong in that person's life. But then the wrong thing happens and that person falls apart. And that's not something you ever you don't want to be in that situation, because that could really affect you negatively. That could basically defeat the whole purpose of why the person thought they should be rigid in the first place. So, and really, when I say rigidity, I want to emphasize, or not emphasize, I want to specify I'm referring to being emotionally rigid. That's a more accurate description. Emotional rigidity. And when we're emotionally rigid and we don't ever show that we have some type of range of emotions that we experience that kind of come natural to just being a human, those emotions have to go somewhere. So while we appear to be emotionless, or we appear to be unaffected, and we hold that posture or that frame real tight to prevent any type of emotional fluctuation, if that person experiences the right amount of stress, or a high level of stress, then that person is going to have possibly going to have an emotional breakdown, meltdown, just going to fall apart. And it'll seem to come out of nowhere. But all this suppressed stuff will come up that the person was putting down because they either didn't want to deal with it, they thought they could just bypass it, and this is something I've done a lot, and I've thankfully been working on over time, and that's allowed me to be more dynamic. It's allowed me to be able to handle life's challenges in a more balanced way, compared to when I was younger, and to a certain degree even up until more recently. So that's what I have for today. If you like the video, definitely like it, leave a comment, and subscribe. Peace and blessings.